the point of our conversation today is on health and healthcare. And what I'm going to do is, with Anna, is to kind of do a little bit of a flyover on what's all involved with health and healthcare. But particularly, I want to hone in on several different aspects. One is the Hippocratic tradition of healthcare and why that makes Western healthcare so unique, and then particularly how that ties into Christianity and the Christian faith, because it ties in directly. Very early on, Christians saw in the Hippocratic Oath a real friend in terms of practicing healthcare, and so we'll talk about that. And then I'm going to kind of arc it, our conversation. Anna will talk a little bit about her experience as a officially she's a doctor in training, I think is what they call her. So she's deputized as a physician, though you'd want to be very careful, like unless she's gotten to your rotation, her rotation, she won't be a lot of help, but she's getting there. And over the next 3 years, starting in June, she'll be training in family medicine, which is a primary care field. So she'll share a bit about the particulars of healthcare, and then I'm going to finish us up by talking about the biblical perspective of health. So where does this idea of the need for health, where does suffering come from, and then what is the answer that Christians offer, and Christianity and the Christian faith offers? Okay? So let's start. Let's talk a little bit about what is health. And I've just got a couple, very anodyne things there. Kind of positively, health means being made whole, or negatively being free of disease. Actually, if you think about the Latin term for health, which is sanitas, that's the word that we get sanitized. So to make something cleansed, or the idea of sanity. A sane person is someone of whole mind, who is of a clean mind. So that's the idea of health overall. And humans have a unique approach to health. I mean, we're different from the rest of the animal realm, so to speak. I mean, you don't see, except maybe in a cartoon or anime, an animal coming forth and caring for humans. Now you'll see it the other direction. There's a whole field called veterinary medicine, but you don't see them caring cross species, and you also don't see typically animals caring for one another. I mean, they might in certain specific dynamics of a female mother animal caring for their whatever children, offspring. But most of that is just by dint of instinct, and not because they have any sort of calling or desire. And certainly it doesn't spread to the whole human realm. So you don't see birds hurting snow leopards or vice versa. In fact, the only thing that a snow leopard wants to do with a bird is not help it, but consume it. So we have in humanity a very unique instinct, and that is to care for people who are struggling, who are sick, who are ill. Okay, so that's a little bit about what is health. So what is health care? Go ahead. It's a preventative act which seeks to disrupt disease or death and promotes life and wholeness. So what are some of those disruptors? Those are illness, which can be temporary, hopefully, disease, which can be more durable and chronic, and either leading to death or really inhibiting a full life, a whole life. And then, of course, we have death itself, and I really don't need to explain that. So where do we get this idea of a human vision, or a vision for answering healthcare needs? So there's kind of two ways to look at this. One is what I would call sort of the generic human approach. You pick any person, you went out what do they call this building now? UCCS or something? Or we used to call it the, okay, this is the RUC. Does the ROC still exist or, okay. We used to have the Rock and that was over that way, but I think new buildings have come and old have gone. Okay. Anyway, so if you walked around this building and asked someone, just grabbed them and said, what's the vision for healthcare that you would have? It might be something like this. Well, it's a natural part of existence in terms of illness. It's caused because of entropy. Everybody experiences it. The universe is in entropy. It's going from order to disorder, if I got that definition right. And so are humans. They're just a part of the universe. And it's something to be fought and resisted against. But then you start to see that you're starting to sneak into an ethic, right? I mean, well, why is that? Why do we fight against illness? And they might say, well, it's a instinct that humans have been given. It's an evolutionary instinct to self-preservation. Well, that makes sense for yourself, but it doesn't make sense for other people, unless I guess you can make the argument that if you're preserving other people, then you're helping yourself. It's that convoluted argument that sometimes you get. But anyways, it's there. So that's the sort of generic, what I would describe as almost the pagan view of illness and then seeking health. What is the Christian vision, which is a little bit different? And this is what it looks like in general in three ways. One is Christians believe that humans are created originally without illness and in God's image. So illness and death are not natural to what it means to be human. It's unnatural. And unfortunately, we live in a world that has experienced so much illness and death, obviously, for thousands of years that it seems natural, but it isn't. Secondly, illness and suffering more generally, and its culmination in death, entered because of a rebellion against the Creator. So it was because of an ethical misstep, so to speak, because we chose to turn our backs on God himself, that this illness and death in reality came into humanity. So actually, Christians have a very specific why to why the world is the way it is. And that, thirdly, very importantly, death and illness have a terminus, have an ending. They're not they won't go on forever. And there will be a time when death and illness, its precursor, will be no more. So very important kind of precursors to our conversation today. And then more generally, what is healthcare? One, it's a preventative act that hinders disease and death or positively promotes life and wholeness. And it's an act of kindness and mercy towards people more generally. So if you think categorically, if I'm being kind to Scott and say, hey, I'll buy you a coffee after the meeting or dinner maybe, and he says, sure, let's go out to Ford's garage and we'll spend it up. Scott likes to go high, and that whole category of kindness, health, and delivering healthcare would be underneath that kind of kindness, those acts of mercy towards people. Okay, so a little bit, let me back us up historically. So what is healthcare historically? Go ahead. Yeah, sorry. Well, one more, there we go. So really it centers in on one person in particular named Hippocrates and an oath that he formulated. Hippocrates lived around, we're not quite sure, but around 460, so 5th century BC into 4th century BC. So about if you think in terms of a timeline, about 400 years before the coming of Christ. If you know your Bible, it's actually post the writing of the last book of the Bible in the Old Testament, Malachi. So during that period. And he was a very influential person of his time, a philosopher, an ethicist, and a physician. So he came up with all kinds of unique treatments for illness and sickness. As he did so, he was I think for his time, he would have been today a leading academician in medicine because he both formulated this whole field of medicine in the ancient Greek world and then decided, hey, there needs to be some boundaries and rules on how we practice medicine. So he came up with this oath, this Hippocratic oath, which I'm actually not going to put on the screen for us, but I'll have a rewrite of that because it's actually been reformulated a number of times. So the oath begins with and centers on 2 or 3 different really key ideas. One is the idea of derived authority. So, and the way the oath reads it is that we swear before Apollos and the other gods that we're going to practice medicine in a certain way. And that's why a lot of oaths today have changed it, because I don't even think the Greeks really believed in Apollos. They believed in the idea of it, or of him. But I'm going to walk us through a restatement of this by the organization that I'm a part of. And a lot of organizations have done this. But you see this whole idea in this restatement, which is essentially true to it, just uses some different terminology that's apropos for Christians. The idea that I'm practicing medicine and healthcare as a dependent act on God. So there's with gratitude to God, faith in Jesus Christ, dependence on the Holy Spirit. I publicly profess my intent to practice medicine for the glory of God. So there's a purpose there as well. And how is it going to be practiced? It's going to be done with humility and a seeking of trying to deepen your training skills and respect for the medical culture. And all those things are really true about doctors in general. One of the things, I've been working with doctors for 25 years. I'm very impressed by how much ongoing training they get in medicine. Every 7 to 10 years, they have to often be re-examined for their credentials and board credentials. And so that's across the board. I'm a Christian, and so a fair amount of my time is spent around other Christians in church and the like. And sometimes I tease my pastors. I'm like, well, what would it be like if you had to every 5 to 7 years be re-credentialed in Hebrew and Greek and in homiletics, which they use for their teaching skills? And I usually get a horrified look on their face, like, oh, that would be awful. I'd totally fail it, or they'd be scrambling like a lot of medical doctors are to get their skills up. But what I'm trying to point at is something very important. They practiced medicine. Hippocrates believed this and passed this down in this oath tradition, that medicine is a derived activity, that you don't have power in and of yourself. You practice it before God or the gods for them. Let me give you a second example of derived authority. And this is actually in our Constitution. So we have constitutionally, we live in a derived authority governance. Let me show you how. The Declaration of Independence, which is one of our 2 key foundational documents, says this: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, asserting that the governments are instituted to secure these rights, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and justifying the colony's separation from Britain, which of course was the point of the Declaration of Independence. So you see 2 derived authorities there. Can you pick them out? What are the 2 things that they're saying we get our authority to do what we're about to do in this declaration from? Yes. Good. Yeah. So you see it right there. Yeah. I'm giving you the answer. If you know how to read underlined, right? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. So yeah. So there's the creed. And what's the second one? From the people. Yeah. So it's derived from the consent of the government. It's derived power. So medicine works the same way. It's very, very, very important that we insist that healthcare be derived in its authority, not in and of itself. When you have authority in and of itself in medicine, inherent authority, you have the possibility of creating a monstrosity in healthcare. Okay, so let's talk about the second major thing in the Hippocratic Oath, which is this idea of restrained practice of medicine, that there are limits to it. So the statement reads, with God's help, I will love those who come to me for healing and comfort. I will honor and care for each patient as a person made in the image of God, putting aside selfish interests, remaining pure and chaste at all times. So essentially that part of the Hippocratic Oath, again, reapplied, but it's really very faithful to the original statement, is a statement of you're having people come to you who are in need. You're going to treat them a certain way because they have been made by God in his image. And we'll talk more about what that means. And you won't seek to take advantage of them financially. Now, that ought to rattle you a little bit, because as Americans, it ought to feel like we're being taken advantage of financially a little bit. I mean, if you had, I had a healthcare challenge in the last 12 months. I got diagnosed with a cardiology issue. And as the bills started coming in, I was like, wow, I mean, this is impressive. Now, thankfully, I had decent insurance, so the bills were shrunk substantially, but even the shrinkage was substantial, and it drained some of my savings. So there's a financial thing, but also pure and chaste at all times. Actually, in the original Hippocratic Oath, it said, the doctor won't take advantage sexually of a patient. Your doctor shouldn't be making moves on you of, whatever setting you are. It's illicit and wrong because you're in a disadvantaged situation. Go ahead. And then the heart of the oath here, the other restraints, circle around this idea of primum non nocere, which is the idea of first do no harm. So the oath reads, with God's guidance, I will endeavor to be a good steward of my skills positively and the society's resources. I will convey God's love in my relationship with family, friends, and community. I will aspire to reflect God's mercy in caring for the lonely, the poor, the suffering, and the dying. So in other words, you won't set up a practice where you just focus in on caring for people who have a lot of money, but you'll actually care for the marginalized and the poor. Being around not only students, but I also work with physicians and dentists and do some shepherding and pastoral work with them. And some of the stories I get from them are shocking of actually, I was talking to a dentist not very recently, and he said, I worked for a practice, and every morning we would have the list of patients that were on there, and then they would have dollar signs. Okay, if you can get them to do this procedure, you'll make $600. If you get them to do this additional procedure, $1,000. If you get, and so it goes. Well, that's contrary to the Hippocratic Oath, and he actually left the practice because of that. Secondly, it says, with God's direction, I will respect the sanctity of human life. I will care for all my patients, rejecting those interventions that either intentionally destroy or actively end human life, including the unborn, the weak and vulnerable, and the terminally ill. And this is very important because Hippocrates actually had this in his original oaths. And it's one of the reasons, as we went through the 20th century, training centers and hospitals stopped issuing it, because as it became more pro-abortion, this idea of having the statement that was, by now it's 2,400 years old, embedded, and it's been a tradition and commitment of the of the healthcare community, they will not end life. Non primum non nocere. First, do no harm. And by definition, abortion is an act of doing harm. So this gives you a little bit of a framework of the whole tradition of healthcare in the Hippocratic Oath realm. And very early on, healthcare got married to Hippocrates, and then as Christians became major movers and shakers in healthcare, which happened very soon after the coming of Christ. What happened was they saw in this an ally. This was largely a commitment that Christians not only could agree with, but could actually say, yeah, we can see this agreeing to what we think what medicine should be. Now, it's interesting. I already alluded to it. The West has begun to decline. So it's like think of a ocean tide coming in, and the tide has started coming out in terms of our commitment to this. And this is what's lost as a result of that. One is this commitment to do no harm. Now, the idea of doing harm in medicine is up for grabs, up for question. So we've seen, in our part of the West, 60 million children aborted in the last 55 years, 60 years. And disproportionate a number of them are African-American children and minority children. So think about the effects of of that practice on our community and our country and what's been lost as a result of that. The practice of euthanasia sprung up in the 1980s and 1990s and got traction first in Western Europe, in the Netherlands and Belgium, and now it's spread through Canada and it's starting to make entrance into various state laws. And what those do is that take the two ends of vulnerability, most vulnerable unborn and the most vulnerable sick people who are elderly and old, and put them at risk. And to say, actually, for you, primum non nocere does not apply necessarily. And as we've seen, because the Netherlands is about 30 years into this project of euthanasia, is that what we feared would happen would be that the definitions of what it meant to be terminally ill would be loosened and broadened, because what happens is that you start to introduce questions of how much does it cost? It costs a lot of money to care for those poor old people, or people with certain types of diseases, or people and you can see you start to define people out of what it means to be made in God's image and to be truly human. One of the, keep on going there, Anna, if you could. One of the more recent examples, very recent, in the last 10 to 15 years, has been things like hormone treatments and intervening surgeries for children who have gender dysphoria, or may even not have an actual diagnosis, but are just seen as struggling with whether they're a boy or a girl. And this practice, again, is starting to jump the fence of this commitment to saying, we will do no harm. The doctor must not step into that direction. And what it does ultimately is it undermines the ability for you and I to go to a physician and to be confident that that physician will not harm me. A friend of mine who used to work extensively in medicine in Africa said that the pagan witch doctors there, which they still exist, honestly. So it's very fascinating. You're like, oh, that's, something, it sounds like something from the 17th century or something. No, they're prevalent in villages and the like. There are witch doctors. And the key question for the witch doctor that you should have in your mind is, did the person who hates me in the village get to the witch doctor before I got to him? And does he have more money than I do? Because if he did, he might tell the witch doctor, would you mind putting something in that healing potion that you put together that instead of healing me, makes me sick? Well, that's what we're becoming, because what happens is our confidence that non primum non nocere is gone or eroded. And so we can't be confident that a physician won't do us harm. Go ahead. So can I trust my doctor? Very quick example of how this happened very recently as well, and a lot of us experienced this, was through the COVID disruption as well. And not in terms of not doing harm, but in terms of messing with the relationship between physicians and their patients. And so typically in healthcare challenges, you turn to a physician who's a part of a community of physicians who's working out, hey, how do I approach this? And he works it out, or she works it out individually for you. So ask questions, says this might be the right way to approach this, etc. Well, there was an intervening authority from above them saying, no, you had to approach this challenge in this certain way. And it has to look at it in this fashion. And if you don't comply, you're in trouble. Well, again, that loosens some of these essential commitments that a doctor has to seeing a patient in a certain way and treating them in a certain fashion. Okay, so let me keep going here, and then I'm going to hand it over to Anna. So some of the early Christian practices for the sick, just a couple things I just want to highlight for us. I mean, I can't give a history of medicine in the West and Christianity. I mean, that'd be a course you could take. But one commitment that Christians had from the get-go, and it's very intriguing, it actually shows up in documentation that Roman leaders wrote. They would write letters. Romans were great at letter writing. That's why we have in the New Testament a bunch of letters, because the Romans, that was culturally the way to express yourself and exchange ideas. They would write these letters, and we have a couple of them preserved. And they said, we've noticed that Christians have this habit of taking children that are unwanted in their towns and villages and cities and taking them and adopting them for themselves. And it was very common practice in urban Roman areas. If you had a child that was born, it was sickly or the wrong gender, which usually meant that the child was a girl, or you had 3 children already, can't feed another one, you would just take the baby and you would set it out in a public area, and the next day it was gone. And usually it was gone because it had been eaten by ravenous dogs that were all around the city. If you go to third world countries, you see it today. These dogs are just wandering around. They're starving, and a human baby is as good a meal as anything. Awful, right? But it was a common practice. Or they just would die of freezing and exposure and not being fed, and then be dumped someplace. And Christians had a practice, because of their belief of life and seeing it in a certain way, of going and rescuing them and taking them for themselves. So it's a whole nother thing. Rodney Stark, who's a sociologist out of Baylor, I think he's retired, have died at this point, but said that this was one of the big reasons why Christianity grew in the Roman Empire, was this idea of taking in the suffering and the poor and the weak was a very inherent instinct that Christians had over the pagans around them. Okay, so preserving life, different from Rome. Secondly, Christians very quickly set up hospitals, and won't go into the whole tradition of that, but Christians saw hospitals as tied into a Christian commitment to hospitality. That this goes all the way back into the Old Testament, Genesis 18, where Abraham welcomes divine visitors who are coming to judge Sodom and Gomorrah, and he shows them great hospitality. And so the Christians have this great vision of welcoming strangers into their midst and caring for them. You see this in the the parable of the Good Samaritan. So, by the way, it's fascinating to me. How many, if I just, that term, Good Samaritan, raise your hand if you know what that means, just the term. Okay, yeah, it's universal. And pretty much, I would say 90% of the people around us know the term Good Samaritan. Now, the percentage will drop significantly if you ask them, where do you get that term from? They'll be like, then it goes probably below 50%. But isn't it fascinating that a term that is derived from a parable, a story that Jesus, at the corner edge of the Roman Empire, told 2,000 years ago, has stuck and is central to our cultural conversation about what it means to be mercy given. But so we have this idea of helping people in need, and hospitals quickly became the way of expressing that. So if you go around the country, you go around the city, if you live in Livonia, you'll probably scurry over to what? St. Mary's Hospital. Well, that's a Christian-based Catholic hospital, and there are a number of them around the city. Not here in Detroit, but if you go further south, there are Presbyterian hospitals and Methodist hospitals. I'm sure I'm leaving out a bunch. And if you go into other countries, there are Christian hospitals. I have friends who've practiced and trained at a hospital in India, in Vellore, India. It is probably one of the best hospitals in India, and it's a mission hospital that was started by Christian missionaries. Christians have this tradition of going into other places and caring for the sick and the poor. This doesn't mean to be a cast aspersions, but I'm going to observe there's not a Muslim hospital in Dearborn. I mean, it's one of the epicenters of Islam in the U.S. As far as I know. I mean, I think there are Muslim clinics for sure, and there are Muslim practitioners, but this organizing, let's care for the poor together, it's central to our faith, is a unique thing for Christianity. The Jews do have some hospitals, so let me be fair about that, but not as widespread as Christians do. And then healing as a calling. Christians have seen healing as being something that God has given them to give to other people, and so that they've been called to that as a service and not as a moneymaker. And that's really important. That's in the Hippocratic Oath again. I really love literature. I like reading books, and so Jane Austen and George Eliot are two of my favorite authors. And George Eliot wrote a book called Middlemarch, very thick, a volume about 19th century life in a town called Middlemarch in England. And one of the main characters is a physician. And anyone read this? Okay, yeah. Do you? How wealthy is that physician? Not at all, right? He's totally struggling. He's living. In fact, his wife is totally beside herself because he's constantly in poverty, and that was very common. Today you go, hey, I'm thinking about going into medicine, and a lot of people are like, yeah, that's a great way to make a great living. That's 70 years old, post World War II. Prior to that, if you went into medicine, you were like, okay, you go in there in the medicine, buddy. You're not gonna make a lot of money, because they were committed to serving the needs of people in dire straits first and foremostly, and the money was immaterial. It's our modern system has produced that. All right, so Anna, I'm going to hand over to you a little bit there.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, John. Yeah, I loved hearing more about kind of the history. And as I've learned over the past few years, more just tidbits of kind of the impact of Christianity on healthcare and how Christians have engaged with the healthcare field, it's been really interesting to me. So cool to hear more about that. I'm going to just jump kind of far ahead from this, early Christian practices for the sick to kind of health professions in the modern day. What does this look like? What does it look like to be someone in healthcare who is a follower of Jesus? And how does my faith impact how I see healthcare? Some of the ways that I feel like what I believe goes really well with kind of where the trends that healthcare are going in, and then also some ways that they kind of maybe are in a little bit of opposition or contention with each other. Definitely a lot of kind of balances and dichotomies there. But just to start off with, before I kind of jump into a little bit of my story, it's kind of a thought question, and feel free to shout out if you think of answers to this. What are some of the reasons that people enter the healthcare fields today?
To help people.
Yes, definitely a really good reason. What are some other reasons that people might pursue a career in healthcare? Yes.
I recently had a physician who did my knees, and he got his profession because of some health issues in his family with him.
Yeah.
And he wanted to go on and then make a difference to help people in
Yeah, that's great. That's really cool.
Parental expectations.
Yeah, I definitely have met plenty of people who have that. Yeah, a parent who's a physician or just wanting their child to have a great career, and that's how they ended up in medicine. Yeah.
Especially being at UM-Dearborn as an undergrad, a lot of my friends said, well, I don't really have a choice what I do for a career, because since I was in diapers, my parents said we didn't cross the ocean together.
Yeah, definitely very common.
That from your parents?
That is a good question. Yeah, so for me, my kind of background in healthcare, I grew up in a family that had a family member in healthcare. My dad is a pediatrician. He has worked for my entire life at actually a Christian health center on the west side of the city of Chicago, serving a underserved population in that area of the city. So a place that not a lot of healthcare workers have historically wanted to go. The clinic was started kind of to fill that gap, and he got to join what they were doing there and has been there for my entire life. So I kind of grew up around healthcare, and also this idea of healthcare as a mission, as a calling. So yeah, lots of reasons people go into healthcare fields today. I think John kind of mentioned this earlier. Money, I put kind of money/security. I feel like a lot of people think of healthcare as a secure field. You're always going to have a job. There will always be sick people that need healthcare, and so definitely I think that has, to people I've talked to, has played into their decisions, not just with going into healthcare, but also what specialty they want to go into, what area of healthcare they want to focus on. Prestige, definitely something as well. I think doctors historically have been, well known for doing a job that is challenging, and also where, you have a certain level historically. I've had a certain level of authority as a doctor. Family pressure, you guys kind of already talked about that. Lifestyle, I think, is something, and maybe not necessarily just going into healthcare, but what people decide to do within that. I feel like a lot of people, as I'm talking with my classmates, I'm a fourth-year medical student at Wayne State, and speaking with a lot of my peers, one of the biggest things that they talk about when they're, talking about what specialty they want to go into. Do you want to do surgery? Do you want to do, dermatology? Do you want to have a private practice? Do you want to work for a hospital? Lifestyle is one of the most common things I hear people bringing up about, what they want to do with healthcare, what they see themselves doing, and, being able to have a lifestyle that you want has been something that a lot of my classmates have been discussing with those decisions. And then kind of the last thing I put up here, and you have, a couple people already mentioned this or similar ideas to this, but this idea of caring for people. And I feel like knowing, a lot of my peers in medical school, this is something that a lot of them, I think, probably we all put it in our personal statements, or many of us anyway, when we were applying to get into medical school, is that I want to take care of people. I've had these past experiences with illness or a family member who had illness, and I want to be able to care for people in those situations. I want to be able to make a difference, to impact other people's lives. But I think for me, as a Christian in healthcare specifically, of course, caring for people really resonates with me. But I think even beyond that, the deeper kind of level, and John touched on this earlier as well, but this idea of caring for people who are made in the image of God. And what is my, how can I do that as a Christian in this field? I think that has been a big driver for me throughout my clinical rotations. For medical school, you spend the first couple of years doing a lot more book and classroom and lab learning, and then the second 2 years, so third and fourth year, are very practically kind of clinical experience heavy. So a lot of time in the hospital, a lot of time interacting with patients. And this has been something that has been on my mind recently. So thinking about, like being made, imago Dei, made in the image of God, comes up at the very beginning of the Bible, in the book of Genesis. There's the creation story, and at the end, this poem where it says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. This idea that I get to care for people who are made in God's image, I think is something that has really impacted my thoughts as I'm going into these patient rooms and discussing these very, deep and personal things with patients. I feel like has been an incredible opportunity, and also something that has really driven me to go into healthcare because of this opportunity to care for people who are made in the image of God, who have value and worth simply because of that. And I think that is something in which healthcare providers who are believers can really add to kind of the overall culture of healthcare. Seen many times talking with other Christian physicians who have had opportunities to really, challenge and stand out, challenge their colleagues and kind of stand apart in this idea of caring for anybody, no matter, what their background is. This month, I've had the opportunity to work with our street medicine group, which is a group of students from Wayne State who do healthcare among the unhoused population, primarily in Detroit, some in the surrounding area. And this has been really incredible opportunity to care for a patient population that honestly has been very overlooked by our healthcare system in a lot of ways. And it has been such a blessing to be able to care for these people and be reminded that these men and women who are in these challenging situations are each and every one of them made in God's image and have value and have worth. And so that's definitely one thing that I've been thinking about, especially this past month. John, I don't know if you have anything to add on this.
I can just sit here and mention. So there's a few things when we talk about this idea of being made in God's image, or imago Dei, which Anna just rightly pointed out. So that's derived right from Genesis 1. But Genesis 2 actually gives us more of what does that mean? I mean, we can say, people are made in God's image. Well, and then are you just free to fill that with whatever things that you would like to? But there's some very particular things that Genesis 2 points us towards. One is the idea of authority. And this idea, especially of derived authority, is very prevalent in Genesis 2. So that Adam and Eve are set in the garden, but under God's rulership. to be rulers themselves. If you want a literary picture of this, look at Lord of the Rings. So you have the steward of Gondor, right? So the steward of Gondor is underneath the king of Gondor, but he has a lot of authority until the king himself comes to take the reins, as it were. And so it is with humans. We have a great deal of authority in this world. Secondly, we have stewardship. So that Adam and Eve were set there to work the land, to order this arboretum, this massive locale. And so humans are given this ability to order the world around them. There's no wonder why we build cities and we create things and dream about going to Mars and et cetera, because we have this idea of being stewards of what we've been given. And we have this drive towards inventiveness and entrepreneurship. It's right there. So in order to order the world, you have to create things to order the world with. Tools, things that will be useful, things that will help you to care for the world, us to care for the world. But again, the world, because it matters to God. And then we're called to be orderers of that world as well. And then most importantly, I think, Genesis and the rest of Genesis, and I was thinking about this as I was preparing for this conversation with you. If you think about the rest of Genesis is really about a family that is called by God to serve the world. And it's summarized in Genesis 12 and then reemphasized in Genesis 15 that Abraham and his offspring are to be possessors of a land that God is going to give them. They're to be to reproduce. So there you see that productivity, and they're to be a blessing to people around them. It's all human-centered, so to speak. So God cares about humanity, and he cares about humanity through a people called to himself, who are called to be in covenant with him and then in covenant with one another as a result of being in covenant with him. So it's a big idea, so when we say Imago Dei, there's a lot of stuff in there, and it's worth for us to kind of consider that.
That was a good commentary.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thanks. I've been thinking about it for a minute. So.
Yeah. And I especially like this. Yeah, this idea of stewardship and God calling us to care for his creation, that includes, all of creation, but especially caring for one another, our fellow human beings, our neighbors, our friends, even our enemies, as often, is brought up with these discussions, the words of Jesus, calling us to love our enemies, and things that were very radical, not just at that time, but honestly at this time too. As I was thinking about this talk today, one passage that came to mind was Luke 5:12 and 13, and I put it up here. And I think this is just a very beautiful picture of what healthcare looks like as a believer. I think that Jesus is a great example of, our great physician who cared for people in very personal ways. And his healthcare ministry obviously looked different. He performed miracles. A lot for our, in this kind of modern Christian world, healthcare world, a lot of times we're providing medications and doing these things which God has allowed us with our human minds to create medications and treatment plans and, using those tools and resources that he's given us, which is also an amazing gift from him. But I think there are still a lot of similarities between how Jesus was caring for people during his time on earth and how we as Christian physicians can care for or should be striving to care for others. So it says, while Jesus was in one of the cities, there came a man who was full of leprosy. not sure what this, when the Bible uses the term leprosy, it's not usually related or using the term for the specific, what we would call leprosy today, but a more general overarching term for different skin diseases. These people were historically shunned, living outside of the city areas, and just, very kind of desperate situation for these people. So there came a man full of leprosy, and when he saw Jesus, he fell on his face and begged him, "Lord, if you will, you can make me clean." And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, "I will, be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him. Obviously, we could see here, this is a miraculous healing that Jesus did, but I think the thing that stands out to me the most is Jesus touching this man. And I think this is something that I am reminded by often is, as a Christian in healthcare, I have the opportunity to be the hands and feet of Jesus and to touch people who may feel not accepted by society, unloved, unwanted, people who have illnesses that are very challenging for them, for their family members. And so the opportunity to enter into people's lives, into their pain, into their suffering, and to bring hope, to bring encouragement, is the reason that I decided to go into healthcare, is to be the hands and feet of Jesus for those people. But I think there's probably something that is maybe sometimes comes to mind thinking of healthcare and medicine, and definitely something that I've had to wrestle with over the past couple of years as I've started to take care of people is, what about what medicine can't fix? When I think about my patients, we may be able to get them through whatever illness they currently have. We may help to prolong their lives, prolong their, increase their quality of life. But ultimately, as we know, this world is a broken place. And we all eventually, each person will die. It's the reality of it, and it's something that I've had to wrestle with and see kind of personally as I've been interacting with patients at all stages of life, from birth all the way through, having several patients this past year who passed away, and walking with their families through that. This is something that we see all the way from the beginning of the Bible as well. We see this beautiful, gorgeous creation that God made, and then we see humanity's rebellion against God. And this is kind of the start of the curse, the death, suffering that we see around us. We see, things in this past, pain in childbearing coming about because of this. We see the ground is, going to be hard to work, and thorns and thistles, and then ultimately, for you are destined to dust, you shall return. And this is something that I've had to definitely wrestle with as a Christian person in healthcare, because I know that ultimately we know what happens to people. Ultimately, we all will die. And so what really is the goal? And I think when I think about it, I go back to thinking about that image of God picture. That as a healthcare person, yes, ultimately, I'm not going to be the one to stop somebody's ultimate death, but as a Christian in healthcare, I have the opportunity to walk alongside people throughout their life, through hard points, through difficult things, and have the opportunity to bring the hope and encouragement of Jesus to them, whether that's through something I say, through medications that are provided, through treatment plans, or through just being somebody who's present with people during the different stages of our lives. And I'm going to pass it off to John for the last few slides here.
Yeah, just want to close up by talking a bit about, two things. Primarily, I want to share about how suffering connects with Christianity, in particular with Jesus Christ himself. And so I'm going to walk us very briefly through two very, very significant portions of Scripture that connect our humanity and our suffering to Jesus. And then secondly, and actually, firstly, for my sake, I'm going to just point out something that's very intriguing to me. And I noticed this years ago. As you read through the life of Christ in the Gospels, what would you say would be the two things that Jesus primarily is doing in the Gospels, activity-wise? Okay, healing. Yeah, so you got my second one. And then what's the other thing? Teaching, preaching, right. So you have today in the Christian church, you have people who are called to preach and teach and such. And then you have people who are called to heal. And I remind Christians going into medicine and who are in medicine and healthcare all the time, you have the chance as a Christian to exercise the very thing that Jesus was doing. Now, only in an akin fashion, because none of them will raise people from the dead. Anna's not going to go around touching a woman who has a persistent 12-year bleeding problem and eradicate it like that. And there's no guarantees where Jesus was 100% in his healing record. But they are an extension of this ministry that Jesus had on earth. I think that's actually pretty cool. So to observe with them. And I don't know, they don't seem to get so jazzed about it when I share about it. I'm like, this is totally awesome. You get to do one of the two things that the king that you followed did. Well, let me share in closing very quickly, two portions of Scripture that tie in to what we started off our conversation with was one of the great crises in our health, which is suffering, illness, and death. And so Psalm 22, which you'll be familiar with because Jesus quotes this on the cross as he himself is suffering and dying. He cries out to God the Father in Aramaic, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he's quoting from Psalm 22. And Psalm 22 is a meditation by someone who has suffered greatly. And again, we don't have enough time to walk through it, but you can go back and look at it later on. But it begins with, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from me and my sufferings? And so the psalmist does, and Psalms are ancient poetry in poetic form, seeks to express something that's universal, that every person does almost instinctively when they suffer. They cry out and go, where is God in this suffering? And so you have this instinctive statement in poetry. And then they start to ask questions like, why have you forsaken me? Why are you not present here in this suffering? And the really amazing thing about that is Jesus, very apparently, as he was facing his death and went to the cross and then was crucified, was thinking about this psalm, was meditating on it, was considering it. I mean, it's got to be the case. He quotes it. I mean, it's almost the last quotation in the Bible from his lips before he dies and is resurrected from the dead. So he assumed that psalm. He actually saw that and thought and believed and was committed, I'm living out this psalm in my death. So it's very important to know the entire psalm as a result. So not only is it someone suffering greatly who is in great distress and is pressed to ask very hard questions about God, but it's also a psalm of faith. So twice, towards the middle of the psalm, it repeats a refrain in verse 10 and 19. Look at it later. You can re-examine it. He prays, Lord, be not far from me. So even though he feels and senses God has abandoned him, and wondering why has God forsaken him, it doesn't stop him from praying to God, Lord, come near to me in my suffering. God, be close to me. It's a very important thing for people in suffering to tell them and remind them, God's not far from you. Your Heavenly Father has not abandoned you in this. He is present here. It's right for us to pray, even though you sense that he's not. And so Jesus entrusted himself into the care of God. And then the end of the psalm, which we often don't really think about enough, is a psalm of words of acclamation, and it's a dual acclamation. It's an acclamation of God's mercy on the person. So God is to be praised for what he's done in delivering this person from this awful plight. But the second part of the psalm says the sufferer is going to be acclaimed as well. He's going to become famous, world famous, globally famous. The psalms attributed to David, as many of the psalms are, about 50% of them, David isn't universally known. I mean, if you said King David, there's a small, it goes back to my Good Samaritan thing. King David's not as famous as the Good Samaritan, especially in the West. But Jesus is much more famous. And it says at the end of the psalm, or near the end, he was not despised or scorned, the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. And Christians believe that that is an intimation of the resurrection of Jesus, that God heard his cry and was pleased with Jesus' death and raised him from the dead to vindicate him from the death that he had suffered. Okay, so a very, very important psalm in terms of thinking about suffering, attaching it to the Christian faith, and thinking about healthcare as well. Second passage is from Hebrews chapter 2, and I've only quoted the last 5 verses from there, but meant to include the whole thing if I could have fit on my PowerPoint, but didn't fit. So anyways, we're going to stick with that. Hebrews 2, verse 10, around there begins with a quotation from Psalm 22. So there's a direct tie in there between the two. And Hebrews 2 is an affirmation of the humanity of Jesus, that he, first of all, shared in our full humanity. Actually, there's points there, yeah. Secondly, he shared in our suffering. So as a human, he suffered the way any human does in this world. I don't know if that meant that Jesus got sick. That's an interesting question. I assume he did. Why not? But it wasn't sickness unto death. That wasn't his calling, but one would assume. But it does say that he suffered in terms of the challenges that humans face and the temptations that we face. That's a key term in that passage. Thirdly, that Jesus' death, when he died himself, it provided an overcoming for death's tyranny. So those who put their faith in Jesus Christ are now given freedom from the fear and the hold of death. Can you see the connection between a vision of that and a vision of Christian healthcare? The connection is we offer people that this isn't the end. You don't have to be terrorized and terrified of what is ahead. Actually, you can be quite hopeful. I remember my mom had a lot of serial illnesses before she died, and she was often in the hospital for a couple of years. And one time she was in the hospital and bed next to us, was occupied by a woman who was a Christian, had a Bible next to her, and I think I chatted with her a couple times. And my mom, who I would say, was probably a Christian, but struggled a lot more to trust God with her illness. At one point whispered to me, she goes, I don't know about that woman just seems way too calm in the face of what she's going through. And I tried to encourage my mom and say, I think she's holding on or knows that Jesus is holding on to her. And, but that's what faith in Christ brings. It's a gift. It's a freedom from the fear and torment of death. Nextly, this passage points us that Jesus now represents us before God the Father as a payment for what causes suffering, which is our sin. And then lastly, the passage affirms that Jesus is raised from the dead, is alive and a living king and a high priest who sympathizes with us in our suffering. And I think in closing, I couldn't think of a better way to close than to say that Jesus is able to help people in suffering. And so Christianity as an overall faith and Christians in healthcare have something to offer deeply the world around them, more than what any other healthcare provider can provide. I mean, they cannot provide that kind of encouragement that this is not the final arbiter, but God has provided the answer for it.